Welcome to Wings of Change, a compelling story of transformation and resilience. Meet Emma, a flight attendant whose routine flight takes an unexpected turn when an emergency forces her to confront deeply ingrained biases. Dr. Naomi Bennett, a skilled and determined doctor on board, steps in during the crisis, setting off a chain of events that will change both their lives forever. What begins as a moment of urgency becomes the catalyst for Emma's journey toward empathy, community, and newfound purpose. Want to find out how a single event can lead to profound change? Stay tuned to uncover the twists and lessons of this powerful tale. If stories of growth and redemption resonate with you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Let's dive into Wings of Change. The morning light spilled across Emma Carter's small, pristine kitchen, catching the glint of the glass coffee pot as it filled. The rhythmic hum of the machine was comforting, a steady beat in an otherwise hectic day. Emma glanced at the clock, noting with a practiced eye that she was right on schedule. As chief flight attendant, precision was second nature to her, and mornings before flights followed a script as well rehearsed as an in-flight safety demonstration. Emma's reflection in the window revealed a woman in her mid-30s, blonde hair tied neatly into a bun, gray eyes sharpened with focus. Today was just another long-haul flight, or so she told herself. But beneath her professional veneer was a current of tension, always there, always controlled. Her mother, Charlotte, had reminded her of the pressure she faced in a career that allowed no room for mistakes. "Emma, you always need to be a step ahead," Charlotte often said, her voice clipped with the discipline of a former schoolteacher. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter pulled Emma from her thoughts. It was a reminder to double-check the crew roster. She scanned the list quickly, noting familiar names like Sophie Allen, her dependable junior flight attendant, and others she had worked with for years. Emma sighed, preparing herself for the day ahead. As she slipped on her uniform jacket, she recited her silent mantra: professionalism first, always. The world she inhabited demanded it, and Emma never allowed herself to be anything less than the best. The airport was alive with the orchestrated chaos of travelers, their movements weaving together like an endless dance. Emma strode through the terminal, head held high, her polished heels clicking a steady rhythm on the polished floor. The airline logo on her uniform caught the morning sun as she greeted her crew, each nod and smile met with expressions of respect. "Morning, Emma," Sophie called, clipboard in hand, her dark curls escaping the tidy ponytail she had hastily secured. Sophie's energy was a blend of eagerness and nerves. She still viewed each flight as a new adventure. Emma's smile was fleeting. "Morning, Sophie. Everything ready? Pre-boarding checks are complete, and the passengers are starting to gather." Sophie's voice was filled with the usual excitement, but Emma's eyes scanned the gate area, mentally noting every detail. Amidst the sea of travelers, a tall woman stood out. Dr. Naomi Bennett had an air of practiced calm. Her eyes were focused on a medical journal as she adjusted her bag's strap, unaware of the subtle glances directed her way. Naomi was accustomed to the quiet skepticism she often met in these spaces, a reminder that success did not shield her from judgment. Emma's gaze lingered longer than she meant it to, a flicker of discomfort tightening her chest. Naomi was on her flight, seated in business class, according to the manifest. Emma swallowed and turned her attention back to the clipboard in Sophie's hands. "Let's keep things on schedule," Emma said, her voice firm, masking the tension she couldn't quite place. Boarding began with the usual sequence. First-class passengers filed in with nods of acknowledgement, some offering smiles, others absorbed in their phones. Emma maintained her professional air, her smile measured, each "welcome aboard" delivered with the same cadence. When Naomi approached, Emma's automatic greeting froze for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Welcome aboard," she said, her eyes meeting Naomi's for a split second before shifting away. There was no hostility, just an absence of warmth that Naomi recognized. She responded with a polite nod and moved down the aisle to her seat. Naomi's seat in business class was positioned near the front of the cabin. She placed her bag under the seat in front of her, settling in as she always did. projecting a composure that had been honed through years of navigating spaces where she was often underestimated. She opened her journal again, though her eyes drifted to the window and the bright expanse of sky waiting outside. Emma continued overseeing the boarding process, yet her mind replayed that brief exchange. It was nothing, she told herself, just another passenger. But deep down, she knew that in that moment, Naomi had seen her, a flash of something guarded and unfinished. With the final round of boarding announcements echoing over the speakers, the cabin doors were secured, and the bustling energy of the terminal faded behind them. Emma walked the aisle, checking seatbelts, stowed luggage, and prepared herself for the pre-flight safety demonstration. Passengers shifted in their seats, arranging pillows and flipping through in-flight magazines, their voices now a low murmur under the soft lighting. Naomi folded her journal and placed it beside her, noticing how the other business-class passengers settled in comfortably, their attention drifting to the polished, choreographed movements of the crew. She was accustomed to being one of the few, if not the only, person of color in such sections of flights. The looks she received ranged from indifferent to questioning, a subtle reminder that each journey she took was layered with complexities most would never know. Emma moved to her position at the front of the cabin, her voice steady as she began the demonstration. Years of practice had made the routine second nature, each movement precise, each word delivered with the assurance expected of her. As she demonstrated how to fasten a seatbelt, her gaze swept over the passengers, pausing when it met Naomi's calm, assessing eyes. The doctor watched attentively, not out of necessity, but out of a quiet habit of vigilance. Emma's eyes shifted quickly, a pulse of discomfort threading through her. She turned her focus back to the demonstration, willing herself to remain composed. The discomfort she felt wasn't something she could easily name, but its roots stretched back to teachings she hadn't questioned until now. As the plane roared into the sky, the pressure change settled the cabin into a collective exhale. The initial moments of flight passed with the usual rhythm. Emma checked on passengers. Sophie passed through with warm towels, and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the galley offered a touch of comfort. Emma found solace in the order of it all, the tasks that kept her mind focused and distanced from more personal musings. Naomi leaned back, glancing briefly at the seatbelt sign before shifting her gaze to the view outside. Clouds rolled by in soft, endless waves, offering a temporary escape from the pressures that awaited her in Chicago. It had been a long month at the hospital, filled with late nights and difficult cases. This flight was meant to be a reprieve, but the tension she felt on board made it clear that rest would come later. A few rows behind Naomi, an elderly couple exchanged stories about their grandchildren, their voices tinged with warmth that momentarily filled the cabin. Naomi smiled faintly, the sound reminding her of moments she'd shared with her own family before medical school, and career ambitions stretched those visits thin. The connection felt both close and unreachable, like a song she hadn't heard in years. Emma noticed the couple too and felt a pang of longing. Her relationship with Charlotte was different, respectful but distant. Charlotte had been her guide, her critic, her unyielding standard, and Emma had strived her whole life to meet those expectations. For her, the idea of being carefree seemed as foreign as the open sky beyond the cabin windows. Emma's reverie was broken by the captain's announcement about the weather conditions for their flight path. She took a final pass through the business-class cabin, her expression controlled, but her mind beginning to tug at the loose threads of everything she had witnessed and felt since they took off. The flight settled into its steady course over the Atlantic, and the cabin lights dimmed, allowing passengers to relax. The sound of soft footsteps and the quiet clink of drink carts moving down the aisle mixed with the steady hum of the engines. Emma moved through her tasks, distributing drinks, answering questions, and maintaining her composed demeanor. The routine kept her anchored, a balm to the discomfort she hadn't been able to shake since Naomi boarded. Naomi sipped a glass of water, her eyes skimming the illuminated pages of a research article on her tablet. Despite the steady beat of routine around her, she felt the weight of her journey, both the literal miles back to Chicago and the metaphorical distance she often felt between herself and the world around her. As a doctor, she had become adept at compartmentalizing, but moments like these, when she was between destinations, allowed the loneliness to creep in. A passenger in the row across from Naomi coughed lightly, and Emma's gaze snapped over, assessing whether it was a call for assistance or just a momentary discomfort. The passenger smiled apologetically, waving off any concern. Emma nodded and continued her work, but her attention flickered to Naomi, who had noticed the brief exchange and returned to her reading with an expression that spoke of familiarity with being on alert. Sophie joined Emma near the galley, her eyes catching the subtle tension etched on her senior colleague's face. "Everything okay?" she asked, handing Emma a cup of water. Emma took a sip, glancing back at the cabin. "Yes, just another long flight." The lie sat between them like an uninvited guest, but Sophie didn't push further. She admired Emma's professionalism, but often wondered what thoughts simmered behind her colleagues' controlled expressions. The flight carried on, with passengers settling into movies or quiet conversations. Emma made her way back down the aisle, her eyes skimming over the business-class passengers. This time, when she looked at Naomi, she noted the slight furrow of her brow as she scanned the article on her tablet. It was a detail she might have missed had she not been so attuned to Naomi's presence. "Can I get you anything else, Dr. Bennett?" Emma asked, her voice carefully neutral. Naomi looked up, momentarily surprised by the direct question. She paused, considering Emma's face, a mask of professional detachment, but with a hint of something more. "No, thank you." "I'm fine," Naomi replied, her tone polite but firm. Emma nodded and moved on, but something about the exchange stayed with her. The brief acknowledgement had opened a door, just a crack, but enough for a whisper of curiosity and doubt to seep in. As she assisted another passenger, Emma's mind lingered on how her reactions might be seen, how they reflected what she had been taught to believe and what she was beginning to question. Charlotte Carter's photograph sat in Emma's wallet, tucked behind a stack of business cards and receipts. The photo, a small snapshot of a summer long past, showed a younger Emma beside her mother at the edge of a lake, their smiles more genuine than before the weight of expectation settled on both their shoulders. Charlotte's high standards had carved Emma into the woman she was, disciplined, accomplished, and wary. As Emma took a moment's rest in the galley, she felt the hard press of her wallet in her pocket. The image of her mother reminded her that, no matter how turbulent her relationship with Charlotte, family was the foundation she couldn't turn away from. Little did Emma know, a moment would soon come when her resolve and all that she believed about herself would be tested in ways she never anticipated. Naomi glanced at her watch, calculating the hours left in the flight. The hum of conversation had lulled to a whisper, the cabin dim with only the glow of reading lights. She stretched her legs, feeling the stiffness from sitting too long, and considered the cases she would need to review as soon as she returned to the hospital. Suddenly, a gentle but unmistakable shift rippled through the cabin as the plane encountered a pocket of turbulence. It was nothing severe, but passengers stirred, tightening seatbelts and glancing around. Emma's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Naomi caught Emma's eye for a fleeting moment as she passed, the shared glance tinged with professional awareness. As the turbulence subsided, the cabin settled once more, though a few anxious passengers exchanged nervous laughs. It was a reminder of the fragility of this suspended space, a world where strangers coexisted between takeoff and landing, each with their own stories, fears, and dreams. Emma walked back to her station, feeling a pulse of relief that the bump had passed. Yet, the air still buzzed with a sense of something unresolved, a feeling that Emma couldn't quite name but felt deep in her chest. The flight wasn't over yet, and neither was the journey of discovery she was only beginning to take. The plane hummed steadily as it soared over the Atlantic, the deep blue sky stretching endlessly outside the cabin windows. Naomi allowed herself a brief moment to relax, leaning back against her seat and closing her eyes. The steady thrum of the engines provided a strange comfort, a backdrop to her thoughts as they wandered from work to the weight of subtle yet persistent judgment she encountered. Emma moved down the aisle, adjusting a passenger's blanket and answering a question about connecting flights. Her practiced smile faltered for just a second when she glanced at Naomi, catching the subtle tension in the doctor's jaw as she sat with her eyes closed. It was a fleeting look, but it made Emma pause. In Naomi's face, she recognized the expression of someone who carried burdens unseen by most, a reminder of how small moments can hold so much more beneath their surface. "Can I get you anything?" Sophie's voice, chipper but respectful, broke through Emma's reverie. Emma turned, her professional mask snapping back into place. "No, thank you. I'm just making sure everything's in order." Sophie nodded, her own eyes flitting over the passengers before settling back on Emma. There was a moment of silence between them, a shared acknowledgement of their mutual professionalism. Sophie had sensed the subtle tension Emma radiated since boarding, but she knew better than to pry. Emma's focus was unwavering, but Sophie had learned to read the subtle clues of the senior flight attendant's moods. A slight tightening of the lips, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her clipboard. "Passengers seem settled for now," Sophie said, trying to ease the silence. "Yes," Emma agreed, though her gaze was still fixed on the cabin. Her mind replayed the look she'd seen in Naomi's face, wondering why it lingered with her more than she cared to admit. The business-class cabin, with its wider seats and extra legroom, was usually a quiet zone, a place where passengers reclined with a sense of entitlement. Naomi shifted in her seat, opening her eyes as she felt a prickling awareness. The sound of low conversation drifted over from 2 seats behind her, where a middle-aged couple whispered about vacation plans. Yet, there was a subtle current to their words that carried a familiar, unspoken strain. It wasn't the words themselves, but the glances that accompanied them, the quick flicks of eyes in her direction, the barely perceptible tightening of expressions. Naomi turned her attention to her tablet, but not before meeting Emma's gaze once more as the flight attendant made her rounds. This time, Emma felt a twinge of discomfort she couldn't place. It wasn't hostility in Naomi's eyes, but a resigned recognition, as if the doctor knew exactly what Emma was thinking, even if Emma herself didn't. "Everything all right, Dr. Bennett?" Emma asked, the formality of the question sharp-edged with practiced politeness. "Yes, thank you," Naomi replied, her voice steady but lacking the warmth that might have softened the exchange. Emma nodded and moved on, a small flame of irritation sparking at the back of her mind. Not at Naomi, but at herself. She wondered why her question had felt inadequate, why there was an undercurrent to every interaction that she couldn't quite articulate. Back in the galley, Emma busied herself with arranging trays and checking supplies. The quiet buzz of the cabin beyond the thin curtain felt like the hum of a distant tide, rhythmic and relentless. Sophie walked over, her eyes catching Emma's as she stacked cups. "Bit tense up there, isn't it?" Sophie ventured, careful with her words. Emma's brow twitched, and she avoided the directness of Sophie's gaze. "It's a long flight. People get restless." "True, but it feels different today," Sophie said lightly, her tone leaving room for Emma to agree or change the subject. Emma sighed, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for a breath. "People bring their stories on board, and sometimes we see glimpses. It's not our place to do more than offer what comfort we can." Sophie nodded, understanding that this was as close to vulnerability as Emma would allow herself in a work setting. "Well, if anyone can handle it, you can." Emma looked up at Sophie, appreciating the unspoken support. It was moments like this, simple and unassuming, that made her realize that the flight crew was more than just colleagues. They were a patchwork family, stitched together by shared hours in the air. The sun began to set, casting the cabin in a warm orange glow. It was the time of day when people drifted into conversations that carried hints of home, talks about plans, stories shared, and memories made. Naomi listened without really hearing, the soft murmur around her like a distant song. Across the aisle, Emma noticed the shift in the cabin's mood. People's guards were down, voices softened, and in the half-light, the veneer of separateness seemed to thin. She saw Naomi place her tablet aside, a hint of weariness in her posture. For a moment, Emma wondered what stories this woman carried with her. What weight lay behind those composed eyes? Just as Emma was about to move on, a passenger approached her, asking for assistance with an overhead compartment. The moment passed, but the flicker of recognition stayed with her, a reminder that the stories people carried were often hidden behind quiet eyes and restrained smiles. The cabin settled into a quieter state as dinner trays were collected and lights dimmed for the night portion of the flight. Emma walked the aisles, her practiced eye-catching details, the crumpled magazine pages, a tilted headrest, a passenger's glasses precariously balanced on the edge of their nose. Each small observation grounded her, reinforcing the order she relied on. Naomi sat back, eyes unfocused, as she stared past her reflection in the window. The faint shimmer of city lights from far below twinkled like stars, miles removed from the realities of her life on the ground. The constant drive to excel, the subtle battles to prove herself, it all felt distant here, in this small world suspended in the sky. "Excuse me," a voice said softly, interrupting Naomi's reverie. She turned to see a young man in his 20s, his expression hesitant as he gestured to the seat next to her. "Do you mind if I grab my bag from under the seat?" Naomi offered a polite nod and shifted her feet to allow him space. The man retrieved his bag with a muttered thanks and sat back down, casting her an awkward smile. It was a fleeting interaction, one that left no trace except in the way Naomi's shoulders relaxed a fraction. Emma watched the exchange from a few rows back, surprised by how attuned she'd become to Naomi's presence. She didn't know why it mattered, why this particular passenger had drawn her attention from the moment she stepped on board. But now, as she saw Naomi's small acts of patience and grace, Emma felt the nagging pull of something deeper than passing curiosity. "Would you like some tea?" Sophie's voice came from behind, accompanied by the soft clink of cups as she maneuvered the cart down the aisle. Emma took a deep breath and nodded, thankful for the brief distraction. "Yes, please," Emma said, as Sophie handed her a steaming cup. Sophie gave her a knowing look, her eyes flicking toward Naomi's row and then back to Emma. "You've been watching her," Sophie said quietly, a hint of curiosity in her tone. Emma's brow furrowed. "It's my job to watch everyone." "Not like that," Sophie replied, a touch of humor in her voice. Emma's lips twitched into what might have been a smile if it weren't for the weight of her thoughts. Sophie moved on, attending to other passengers, leaving Emma with the echo of her words. Moments later, Emma found herself pausing at Naomi's seat again, unplanned but inevitable. "Dr. Bennett, are you comfortable? Would you like anything before we turn down the lights?" Naomi looked up, a faint shadow of fatigue under her eyes. "A cup of tea would be nice." "Thank you." Emma signaled Sophie, who returned promptly with the tea. The brief interaction held no grand gestures, no sudden revelations, but there was a shift, subtle as a sigh. Naomi's thank you was sincere, and Emma's nod was less guarded. The edges of their silence softened. Hours passed as the plane crossed time zones, moving toward dawn. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a blanket or the sound of a page turning. Emma sat in her small jumpseat at the back of the cabin, legs stretched out and arms folded, staring at the ceiling panel with a mix of exhaustion and thoughtfulness. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, flipping it open to the picture of Charlotte. The young Emma in the photo looked carefree, with sun-tinted hair and eyes that hadn't yet learned the art of masking doubt. The woman she had become was molded by expectations, of precision, of resilience, of an armor that protected her from the world and herself. A slight jolt ran through the plane, just enough to wake a few passengers. Emma stood, checking on those who stirred, eyes brushing past Naomi once more. The doctor was awake, her fingers drumming softly on the armrest, eyes scanning the seatback in front of her, as if searching for answers in the stitching. Emma approached again, this time without a scripted reason. "Everything all right, Dr. Bennett?" Naomi's eyes shifted to Emma, studying her as if weighing whether to respond honestly or dismiss the question. "I find it hard to sleep on flights," Naomi admitted finally, her voice low. Emma nodded. "It's the hum of the engines, You'd think it would lull you, but sometimes it just keeps you thinking." Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, Emma saw a glimpse of the woman beyond the professional. "Exactly," Naomi said. There was a shared moment, small and fragile, where Emma felt the weight of her biases and the realization that they had never been about Naomi, but about herself and what she had been taught to see. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but it left a mark, a tiny ripple of change moving through the air between them. The first hint of dawn painted the horizon in hues of purple and gold, casting a soft glow over the quiet cabin. The passengers stirred, adjusting their seats and stretching limbs that had grown stiff with sleep. Emma's voice came over the intercom, clear and professional, though a touch softer than before. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be serving breakfast shortly as we prepare for the final leg of our journey. We hope you had a restful flight." Naomi glanced out the window, the light breaking through the dark like a promise. The plane felt different now, as if the night had carried with it whispers of stories, half-told and unvoiced realizations. Emma met Naomi's gaze one last time before turning to assist Sophie in distributing breakfast trays. The recognition in that look was quiet but profound, a beginning of understanding. The cabin buzzed with morning activity as passengers reached for their trays and accepted steaming cups of coffee or tea from the flight attendants. The early sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating faces lined with sleep and travel weariness. Naomi cradled her tea with both hands, allowing its warmth to seep into her fingers. The day ahead would be relentless. As soon as the plane landed, she'd step back into her role at the hospital, facing a queue of patients and administrative hurdles. Emma maneuvered through the aisles, her eyes sharp as she made sure the service ran smoothly. The tension from the previous night had eased, replaced by the mechanical comfort of routine. Yet, beneath the surface, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, both within her and in her perception of Naomi. The flight's small interactions, so often dismissed as trivial, carried unexpected weight today. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett. Would you care for anything else?" Emma asked, her voice neutral, but lacking the practiced coolness it usually held. Naomi looked up, the shadows under her eyes lighter but still present. "No, this is fine. Thank you." Emma nodded and moved on, but the brief exchange left behind a hum of awareness. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. A subtle shift that made Emma consider the layers of assumptions she'd carried for so long. Naomi placed her empty cup on the tray and turned back to her tablet, but her focus drifted as the murmurs around her grew louder. Passengers exchanged travel plans and stories, the sound building a low collective narrative of hopes, anxieties, and excitement. Naomi's mind traveled to her hospital, to the team she would soon lead through a demanding week. The sound of a child giggling a few rows ahead pulled her back to the present, reminding her that life was stitched together by these quiet moments between responsibilities. Emma, now stationed at the back of the cabin, felt the cabin shift from the stillness of night to the chatter of morning. Sophie, appearing at her side, handed her a clipboard with a rundown of passenger requests. "Looks like a few people are asking about connections," Sophie said, glancing at the rows of waking travelers. "Dr. Bennett seems like she's had a long night." Emma followed Sophie's gaze to where Naomi sat. The doctor's posture, upright and poised, hinted at exhaustion but revealed no weakness. It was something Emma recognized in herself, the determination to hold steady no matter what. "Yes," Emma said, her voice barely more than a murmur. It was both an observation and an acknowledgement of the distance she felt compelled to bridge. Just as breakfast service concluded, the hum of the plane was interrupted by a sudden change in rhythm. Emma noticed it first, a tiny tremor that ran beneath her feet, vibrating up through the soles of her shoes. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but with an edge that set her nerves on alert. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a patch of unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The cabin shifted from relaxed conversation to the sharp rustle of seatbelts and the anxious glances of passengers. Emma's practiced movements quickened as she walked the aisle, making sure everyone was secure. Naomi sat straighter, fingers gripping the armrest as she glanced around. assessing the reactions of those around her out of both habit and a subtle, protective instinct. The plane dipped slightly, eliciting gasps and nervous laughter from passengers. Emma's heart raced, but she maintained her professional calm, her voice cutting through the cabin as she reminded everyone to stay seated. "Keep your seatbelts fastened, please. We're monitoring the situation," she said, catching Naomi's eye as she passed. The doctor's expression mirrored Emma's own, a mixture of focus and calm under pressure. The turbulence lasted only a few moments, but left a charged silence in its wake. Emma stood near the galley, catching her breath as she watched the passengers settle once more. A few exchanged relieved smiles, while others stared out the windows, avoiding eye contact as if embarrassed by their initial panic. "Everything all right?" Sophie asked, appearing at Emma's side with her own expression of mild concern. "Yes, just turbulence," Emma replied, though her heart hadn't quite steadied. It was strange how quickly the illusion of control could be shaken. When the plane stabilized and the seatbelt sign turned off, Emma resumed her rounds, the cabin gradually filling with a sense of cautious relief. Passengers spoke in softer tones, as if mindful of tempting fate. Naomi took a deep breath and released her grip on the armrest, flexing her fingers to rid them of tension. Emma paused by her seat again, this time less by accident, and more by an unspoken decision. "Dr. Bennett, is everything all right?" The question felt more genuine now, as if layered with more than just protocol. Naomi met Emma's eyes, and there was a flicker of understanding between them. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for asking." Emma nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting in a subtle acknowledgement before she moved on. It was just a small moment, but in it, the divide between them felt less daunting, as if they were both starting to see each other more clearly. As the morning wore on, the tension in the cabin faded, replaced by the normalcy of an in-flight movie and the soft snores of sleeping passengers. Naomi watched the screen in front of her with detached interest, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed Emma's concerned look, the way her voice softened in that brief exchange. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Emma, for her part, felt a shift in herself. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she knew that her perception of Naomi was no longer just that of a passenger she needed to manage or an unwelcome reminder of her own biases. It was deeper now, colored by the realization that everyone carried their own burdens, visible or not. The turbulence, brief and inconsequential as it had been, left a ripple in its wake, one that would reach further than Emma could yet imagine. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm, the sun now high in the sky, casting a warm glow that seemed to reassure the passengers. Emma took a moment to glance out the window, catching a brief moment of tranquility in the layered blue of the sky and clouds below. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the morning dissipate. The lull was comforting, a reminder of why she loved the order of her job. But the calm was broken by a sudden gasp from the front of the first-class cabin. Emma's head snapped up as she saw Charlotte, her mother, slump forward in her seat. The tray table clattered as it shifted beneath her weight, the sound slicing through the quiet. Gasps and murmurs spread through the rows, a current of fear replacing the peaceful chatter. "Mom?" The word caught in Emma's throat as she rushed forward, her professionalism forgotten in an instant. She reached Charlotte's side, shaking her gently, trying to keep the panic from taking over. "Mom, can you hear me?" There was no response, just the pale stillness of her mother's face. "Is there a doctor on board?" Emma's voice broke as it carried through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, eyes wide with concern, but no one moved. Then Naomi stood. The hesitation was only a heartbeat long before she stepped forward, her voice clear and composed. "I'm a doctor." The cabin fell silent as Naomi approached, the initial shock in Emma's eyes quickly overshadowed by desperation. Without waiting for Emma's approval, Naomi knelt beside Charlotte, gently taking her wrist to check for a pulse. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, every breath held as Naomi assessed the situation. "Help me lay her back," Naomi instructed, her voice steady. Emma blinked, the command jolting her into action as she helped ease her mother into a safer position. Naomi worked methodically, tilting Charlotte's head back and ensuring her airway was clear. Naomi's calm was infectious, a still point in the chaotic energy of the cabin. "She's breathing, but her pulse is weak," Naomi announced. "She'll need oxygen, and we need to monitor her until we land." Emma nodded, her hands shaking as she grabbed the emergency medical kit and handed it to Naomi. Sophie appeared with the oxygen tank, her eyes wide but determined. "Here," Sophie said, passing it over as quickly as she could. Naomi secured the mask over Charlotte's face, adjusting it to fit snugly. The first shallow rise and fall of Charlotte's chest under the oxygen mask sent a rush of relief through Emma, though the fear still thudded in her veins. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, some whispering prayers, others glancing at their own family members as if to reassure themselves. Naomi's professionalism cut through the tension, her movements precise, her focus unshakable. "She's stable for now, but we'll need paramedics ready when we land," Naomi said, looking up at Emma. The clarity in Naomi's gaze steadied Emma's nerves, grounding her in the moment. It was then that Emma felt a pang of gratitude, so sharp it hurt. She nodded, swallowing hard as she moved to the intercom to inform the captain. The captain's announcement came over the speakers, a firm reminder for all passengers to remain seated as the plane began its descent into Chicago. The tone was calm but urgent, and the murmurs in the cabin hushed once more. Emma knelt beside her mother, holding her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against her own. Naomi remained beside Charlotte, checking her pulse periodically and making small adjustments to ensure her stability. Every minute felt stretched, the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of a drink cart, the only sounds breaking the silence. Emma stole a glance at Naomi, who met her eyes with a look that spoke volumes. There was no room for the tension they had shared, only the immediacy of life and the human connection it demanded. Emma nodded once, a silent thank you, before turning her attention back to Charlotte. Sophie moved quietly through the cabin, assuring passengers and calming the few who seemed most anxious. Her eyes darted toward Emma now and then, a silent show of support that Emma appreciated more than words could convey. The first bumps of turbulence signaled their approach to the airport. Naomi's hand stayed steady on Charlotte's wrist, counting each pulse, her face a mask of concentration. Emma held her breath, each shift of the plane tightening the coil of anxiety in her chest. The wheels hit the tarmac with a thud, and the collective breath held by the entire cabin released in a rush. Emma felt the plane slow, the familiar rumble beneath her feet, a comfort despite the circumstances. The captain's voice returned, announcing their arrival and requesting passengers remain seated until paramedics could board. Within moments, the first responders stepped into the cabin, their uniforms crisp and their movements efficient. Emma moved aside as they assessed Charlotte, exchanging quick words with Naomi, who relayed everything she had done during the flight. "You did well," one of the paramedics said, giving Naomi a nod of respect before turning back to their patient. Emma's throat tightened, tears she hadn't allowed herself to feel, now threatening to spill as she watched them wheel her mother out. Naomi stood, exhaustion etched in the lines of her face, and met Emma's gaze one last time before returning to her seat. The cabin felt both larger and smaller, filled with the residue of a shared crisis that would linger far beyond the flight itself. As the paramedics disappeared through the cabin door with Charlotte, a ripple of applause broke out among the passengers. It was hesitant at first, then grew stronger as people turned to look at Naomi with newfound respect. The sound caught Emma by surprise, snapping her from her daze. She glanced at Naomi, who offered a small, tired smile before looking down at her hands, the applause washing over her without changing her composure. Emma stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the scene, the gratitude of strangers directed at the woman she had judged without knowing. Sophie touched her arm gently, breaking the spell. "She's going to be okay, Emma," Sophie whispered. Emma nodded, a single tear slipping free. She wiped it away, grateful for the noise of clapping that masked her raw emotion. It was a moment she would return to many times, the day her perspective cracked open, letting light and doubt pour in. The cabin settled back into an uneasy calm, passengers shifting in their seats as the shock of the last hour began to ebb. Emma leaned against the bulkhead, her mind spinning between flashes of the incident and the image of her mother's pale face. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the crisis drained away, leaving her limbs heavy and her breath shaky. "Hey," Sophie said, her voice low as she approached Emma. The junior attendant's eyes were wide with lingering concern, but she offered a tentative smile. "You did great." "We all did." Emma nodded, unable to form words. She glanced back at Naomi, who sat quietly, eyes closed and head tilted back against her seat. The exhaustion was palpable, visible in the slight droop of her shoulders. Emma felt a sudden, overwhelming need to speak to her, to offer thanks, but the words stuck in her throat. The captain's voice broke the silence, announcing that passengers would soon disembark and that priority would be given to those involved in the emergency. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized this flight had been more than just another routine shift. It had been a turning point, though she couldn't yet grasp what that truly meant. The first-class passengers exited slowly, many casting glances back at Naomi with expressions of gratitude and hushed conversations. A few reached out with quiet thank yous as they passed, their eyes lingering on the woman who had stepped up when it mattered most. Naomi acknowledged them with slight nods, her professional reserve masking her fatigue. Emma stepped aside as the last of the business-class passengers filed out. She watched the paramedics move Charlotte through the narrow walkway and out of sight, the realization of what had just happened settling heavily on her. The fear, the helplessness, it all came rushing back now that there was nothing left to do but wait. Naomi stood, adjusting her coat and gathering her things with the deliberate movements of someone used to holding it together until the last possible moment. Emma took a step forward, her hand reaching out involuntarily. "Dr. Bennett," she called, the formal address carrying an unspoken plea. Naomi paused, turning to meet Emma's eyes. The weight of the past few hours hung between them, layered with gratitude and unspoken apologies. "Yes?" Naomi's voice was soft, touched with the same exhaustion Emma felt. "Thank you," Emma said, the words catching slightly in her throat. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was a start. Naomi nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting in a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Take care of her. She's strong." The words landed like a balm, offering comfort Emma hadn't known she needed. Before she could respond, Naomi was moving down the aisle, blending into the flow of disembarking passengers. Emma watched her go, the memory of the doctor's steady hands and calm voice etched into her mind. The sterile corridors of the hospital were cold and unwelcoming, their walls echoing the hurried footsteps of nurses and the low murmur of conversations. Emma sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The ache in her knuckles, a welcome distraction from the gnawing worry in her chest. Sophie had insisted on coming with her, sitting nearby with an air of quiet support. Time stretched and contracted in unpredictable ways as Emma replayed the flight in her mind. The moment Charlotte collapsed, Naomi's intervention. The relief that followed. The memory of Naomi's calm, confident expression lingered, bringing with it a confusing mix of emotions. A doctor appeared, clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning the room until they found Emma. She stood too quickly, swaying slightly before steadying herself. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice professional but kind. "Yes, that's me," Emma said, barely above a whisper. "Your mother is stable. She experienced a syncopal episode, likely due to dehydration and fatigue. We're monitoring her and will run more tests, but she's resting comfortably now." Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her, followed by a fresh wave of gratitude for Naomi's quick actions. "Can I see her?" she asked, hope threading through her voice. The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes? She needs rest." Sophie touched Emma's arm as she passed, offering a small, supportive smile. Emma didn't need words to understand the unspoken encouragement. She followed the doctor down the hallway, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing softly, guiding her toward a new understanding of what had unfolded on that flight. Charlotte's room was quiet, the steady beep of monitors and the soft rustle of hospital sheets the only sounds breaking the stillness. Emma stood at the doorway, taking in her mother's fragile state with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The older woman's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Emma with the clarity of someone who had just come back from the edge. "Emma," Charlotte said, her voice a whisper but strong enough to reach across the space between them. Emma approached the bed, her legs feeling unsteady, and sat in the chair beside her. "You scared me," she said, a small, tearful laugh breaking through. Charlotte managed a faint smile, her eyes searching Emma's face. "I'm here, aren't I?" she said softly. The words carried more than just the acknowledgement of her presence. They held a deeper truth, one that Emma was only beginning to understand. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past hours settling around them. Emma thought of Naomi, of the way she had taken control with unwavering assurance. The urge to tell Charlotte about the doctor's actions welled up, but for now, she let the silence speak for itself. Emma stepped back into the waiting room where Sophie sat, a relieved smile breaking across her face as Emma approached. "How is she?" Sophie asked, her voice hushed with concern. "She's stable. They're running more tests, but she's awake," Emma said, the words feeling like a gift she didn't know she'd been waiting for. She slumped into the chair beside Sophie, the exhaustion catching up to her now that the adrenaline had faded. "That's good news," Sophie said, her expression softening. After a moment, she added, "You know what Dr. Bennett did? It was incredible. We're lucky she was there." Emma nodded, her eyes staring at the sterile tiles of the hospital floor. "Yeah," she whispered, the simple agreement carrying with it an unspoken promise that she would reach out, find a way to bridge the distance between them and the woman who had saved her mother's life. The waiting room hummed with the low conversation of other families, each story its own microcosm of worry and hope. Emma's story was changing, she realized, not just because of the crisis, but because of what it had revealed. The journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The following morning brought a heavy sky, its gray clouds hanging low over the hospital parking lot, as Emma stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The crisp wind felt sharp against her face, a bracing reminder that the world moved on even when personal upheaval made it seem as though time had stopped. The night had been long, with Charlotte drifting in and out of sleep and Emma sitting vigil, her thoughts spinning between gratitude and guilt. Every time she closed her eyes, Emma saw Naomi's calm face as she worked to save Charlotte. It should have been comforting, but instead, it unsettled her. It forced her to confront the quiet, insidious truths she'd ignored for too long. Biases she had clung to without question, learned through years of silent nods and conversations cut short. Back inside, Charlotte was being prepped for another round of tests. Emma returned to the waiting room, the rhythmic ticking of the clock marking time in the sterile quiet. She sank into a chair and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the notifications she'd ignored since landing. Among them was a message from the airline's HR department, notifying her that an inquiry would be conducted due to the viral video circulating online. The video, she hadn't watched it yet, but knew enough from what Sophie had told her. A passenger had filmed Naomi springing into action and, in the process, captured Emma's initial hesitation. The clip had sparked discussions online, some praising Naomi's professionalism, others speculating on the flight crew's behavior. Emma felt a mix of fear and shame rise in her throat. She couldn't hide from this any longer. Later that day, Emma found a quiet corner in the hospital lobby and opened the video. The shaky footage showed the moment Naomi identified herself as a doctor. The way she moved with purpose, despite the silent skepticism that seemed to hang in the air. Emma's own voice sounded clipped and uncertain in the recording as she called for help. Watching it from the perspective of a passenger made it impossible to ignore the initial reluctance in her tone. The comments below the video were a mix of praise and critique. "Dr. Bennett is a hero, incredible work under pressure. Why did it take so long for her to be taken seriously?" You can see the doubt in the crew's faces. "It's sad that this still happens." Emma's hands trembled as she closed her phone, the screen going dark and reflecting her troubled expression. It wasn't just the potential career repercussions that bothered her. It was the truth behind the criticism. She had failed Naomi in that moment, and no amount of professionalism could undo the way that failure now defined her in the eyes of those who watched. Sophie approached Emma later that afternoon, her voice quiet as she said, "You've seen it, haven't you?" Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I should have done better." Sophie sat down beside her, folding her hands in her lap. "We all have things to learn, Emma. What matters now is what you do next." The simple statement carried a weight that made Emma's eyes sting. She knew Sophie was right, and the idea of doing nothing was unbearable. An idea took root in her mind, something that felt both necessary and daunting. She would write to Naomi, reach out in a way that stripped back the formalities and showed her genuine remorse. Emma would need to step out from behind her shield of professionalism and be vulnerable. Emma sat with a notepad in her hands, the blank paper seeming to taunt her. "How did you put regret and realization into words without sounding empty?" She tapped her pen against her lip, the soft click echoing in the silent room. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and cautious. "Dr. Bennett, I owe you a sincere apology, not just as a member of the flight crew that day, but as a person who, in that moment, allowed judgment to cloud my better nature. Your actions saved my mother's life, and I am grateful beyond words. But gratitude isn't enough. I want you to know that I'm learning, that I recognize what I failed to see before. The quiet strength it takes to face doubt and still act with compassion and skill. I admire that in you, and I'm sorry it took this for me to understand. With respect, Emma Carter." She read the letter over, the words still feeling too light for the weight they carried. But it was honest, and for now, that would have to be enough. Emma sealed it in an envelope, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of whether it would be read or ignored. The next morning, Emma gathered the letter and drove to Naomi's hospital. The city bustled around her, indifferent to her inner turmoil. The entrance to the hospital was familiar, yet it felt different as she stepped inside with a purpose that made her pulse quicken. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to leave this for Dr. Bennett," Emma said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. The receptionist glanced at the envelope, noting the slight tremor in Emma's fingers as she passed it over. "I'll make sure she gets it," the woman said, placing it in a small tray marked for internal deliveries. Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and nodded. "Thank you," she said before turning to leave, the echo of her footsteps following her down the corridor. Emma's days fell into a pattern of hospital visits and moments of reflection as she waited for a response that might never come. Charlotte's condition improved steadily, bringing Emma a sense of relief that was shadowed by the unresolved tension of her apology. She spoke with Sophie often, who reassured her that taking the step to reach out was more than many would have done. "You put yourself out there, Emma," Sophie said during one evening phone call. "That takes courage." "Does it?" Emma asked, staring at the skyline outside her window. "Or is it just what I should have done all along?" Sophie sighed on the other end. "Maybe it's both. But either way, you're facing it, and that counts for something." Emma hung up, the conversation leaving her with a restless kind of hope, one that felt fragile but real. A week after dropping off the letter, Emma was in the hospital cafeteria, stirring cream into her coffee and watching the swirl of white spread through the dark liquid. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice catching slightly. "Miss Carter?" The voice on the other end was familiar, calm and composed. "It was Naomi. I received your letter." Emma's heart thudded, each beat louder than the last. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you'd want to." There was a pause. Then Naomi said, "I appreciate the gesture. If you're willing, I think we should talk." The noise of the cafeteria seemed to fade as Emma nodded, the weight of the past week lifting, just slightly. "I'd like that," she said, feeling for the first time in days the stirrings of something hopeful. The next day, Emma sat in her car outside Naomi's hospital, fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. The city moved around her, unaware of the pivotal moment she was about to face. A text from Naomi had confirmed the time and place, a small office in the administration wing of the hospital. Emma had replayed what she might say over and over in her mind, trying to find the balance between apology and understanding. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped out of the car and walked through the hospital's automatic doors. The smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing in the air. The receptionist directed her down the hall where Naomi was waiting. "Ms. Carter, Dr. Bennett will see you now," the receptionist said with a professional smile. Emma nodded, her pulse quickening as she approached the room. The office was small, filled with medical textbooks and framed degrees. Naomi sat behind a desk, her posture relaxed, but her eyes observant. She gestured to the chair opposite her, and Emma sat, feeling the weight of the silence settle between them. "Thank you for coming," Naomi began, breaking the stillness. Her voice was as composed as it had been on the plane, but there was something more now, a guarded curiosity. Emma nodded, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you didn't have to." Naomi studied her for a moment before responding. "Your letter was honest. That's why we're here. I think it's important to talk about what happened on that flight and what it meant." Emma swallowed, the guilt of that moment still sharp in her memory. "I wanted to say it face to face. You saved my mother's life, and I owe you more than a thank you. I need you to know that I see now how much more there was to that moment than just a medical emergency." Naomi's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "You're right. There was more. I've been in situations where my qualifications were doubted, where I had to prove myself over and over. Not just because I was a doctor, but because I was a black woman in that role. But on that flight, I chose not to focus on that. I couldn't afford to." Emma's chest tightened. "I've spent these past days thinking about that, how my own hesitation was part of the problem. I'm sorry it took a moment like that for me to see it clearly." The room fell quiet again, the pause filled with unspoken understanding. Naomi's gaze softened as she recognized the sincerity in Emma's eyes. Acknowledging it is the first step, but what you do with that realization is what matters. Emma nodded, the heaviness in her chest lifting slightly. "I want to do better, to be better. Not just for show, but because I understand now that this is about more than just me." The conversation shifted, easing into a more open exchange. Naomi spoke of her early years in medical school, where she'd often been the only person of color in a lecture hall and felt the unspoken challenge of representing more than just herself. She shared anecdotes that were both painful and triumphant, small moments of recognition from patients, the satisfaction of being trusted and respected for her skill. Emma listened, absorbing each word, each story that painted a broader picture of the journey Naomi had endured. She realized that her own career, marked by its own pressures, was a different path that had not carried the same burdens. "There was this one time during my residency," Naomi said, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I was exhausted, coming off a double shift, and one of the senior doctors mistook me for a new nurse. The patient corrected him before I could, and the look on his face was priceless. It shouldn't have been funny, but in that moment, it was." Emma smiled, the shared laughter lightening the air between them. It was a story that revealed both the absurdity and resilience that marked Naomi's journey. As the conversation wound down, Emma felt a deeper connection form, a respect that extended beyond gratitude. She realized that this wasn't just about righting a personal wrong, but about participating in a broader shift toward empathy and change. Naomi leaned back, crossing her arms loosely. "I appreciate you taking this step, Emma. It's not easy to confront things we'd rather not see in ourselves." Emma nodded, her eyes earnest. "I know there's more work to do, but this, talking to you, has been more eye-opening than I can say. If there's ever anything I can do, professionally or otherwise, to support what you do, please tell me." Naomi's eyes held a glimmer of surprise, but also understanding. "Keep listening, keep learning, and when it counts, stand up, not just for people like me, but for anyone who faces those quiet doubts and barriers." Emma stood as Naomi extended her hand. The handshake was firm, charged with the acknowledgement of what had been and what could be. As Emma left the office, The noise of the hospital washed over her, a reminder that the world was full of stories as complex and intertwined as their own. Back in the waiting room, Emma found Sophie waiting with a knowing look. "How did it go?" Sophie asked, her curiosity evident. Emma took a deep breath, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying start to ease. "It was honest and necessary." Sophie nodded, her smile widening. "Good. I think this whole experience has changed more than just you." Emma sat down beside Sophie, the hum of the hospital filling the spaces between their words. For the first time in days, she felt something shift within her, a readiness to take the lessons she'd learned and weave them into the fabric of her life, one conscious decision at a time. The next day, Emma was at her mother's side as Charlotte prepared to be discharged. The older woman's color had returned, and she looked stronger, though there was a touch of weariness in her eyes. "Did you get to thank her?" Charlotte asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Emma nodded, a warm smile crossing her face. "I did, and we talked." Charlotte's expression softened, pride and understanding mingling there. "Good. Sometimes it takes moments like these to remind us of what really matters." Emma squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the truth of that statement settle deep within her. The journey wasn't over, neither her own nor the one she shared with those around her. But for the first time, Emma felt like she was moving in the right direction. Emma's return to the airline was met with a mixture of support and curiosity. The internal investigation had wrapped up with no official reprimands, but Emma knew that the true change had to come from within. Determined to back her words with actions, she reached out to Naomi, offering to help with community initiatives at her hospital. Naomi's response was unexpectedly warm. "We're always looking for volunteers for outreach events," she'd said. And so, on a bright Saturday morning, Emma found herself at a community health fair organized by Naomi's hospital. The open space buzzed with energy, with tents set up for blood pressure checks, free consultations, and nutritional advice. Children laughed as they chased each other between booths, and the air smelled of popcorn and grilled food from nearby food trucks. Sophie had joined her, the two of them wearing matching volunteer shirts that read, "Health Matters," in bold, friendly letters. Emma scanned the area, noting Naomi at one of the medical tents, talking animatedly to a group of attendees. There was a confidence and warmth in Naomi's posture that Emma couldn't help but admire. "Ready?" Sophie asked, nudging Emma with her elbow. Emma smiled, a real unguarded smile. More than ever. The day passed quickly as Emma assisted with registration, distributed flyers, and talked with attendees about health resources available at the hospital. The conversations were easy, punctuated with laughter and moments of genuine connection. Emma found herself learning names and stories, each one adding to the mosaic of the community Naomi served so passionately. At one point, Naomi approached with a clipboard in hand. "How's it going over here?" she asked, her eyes catching Emma's. Emma nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "Better than I expected. People are so open, so willing to share." Naomi's smile held approval. "That's the thing about community. You don't really see it until you step into it." "You're doing great, Emma." The praise settled warmly in Emma's chest, a quiet acknowledgement of how far she'd come. She returned to her tasks with renewed energy, feeling the invisible threads of understanding binding her to the people around her. The fair wound down as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. The volunteers began dismantling booths and packing up supplies. Naomi and Emma found themselves standing side by side as they watched the last of the families leave, their voices a soft hum in the cooling air. "Thank you for coming today," Naomi said, her tone sincere. "It means more than you know to see someone take what they've learned and put it into practice." Emma met Naomi's eyes, her voice steady as she replied, "I should be thanking you. You showed me a better way to look at things, to see people." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Naomi added, "Change isn't about a single moment. It's about what you do after, how you keep moving forward." Emma nodded, the words resonating deeply. "I'm starting to understand that." Over the following weeks, Emma became a familiar face at the hospital's community events. She volunteered regularly, learning more about public health and the challenges faced by those who came to the hospital for care. Each day brought a new story: a single mother navigating diabetes, an elderly man seeking advice on heart health, a teenager asking questions about college scholarships. Emma's interactions became less about obligation and more about genuine connection. Sophie often joined her, bringing her characteristic lightness and enthusiasm. The crew at the hospital welcomed them, creating an environment where Emma felt not just included, but integral. The passengers from her flights began to notice changes too. Emma's approach became warmer, her smile easier, and her responses infused with a kindness that came from seeing people as more than just seat numbers. One afternoon, while packing up from a health workshop, Emma turned to see a familiar face among the attendees. It was one of the passengers from the flight, the young man who had hesitated before reaching for his bag during the turbulence. He approached her, recognition flickering in his eyes. "I thought I recognized you," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "You're the flight attendant from that plane." Emma's heartbeat quickened as memories of the flight surfaced, but she returned the smile. "Yes, that was quite a day." The man's expression turned thoughtful. "I saw what happened, how you and Dr. Bennett handled everything. It was intense, but it was good to see people stepping up like that. I'm glad to see you here." The words brought an unexpected surge of emotion, affirming that the ripples from that day had spread further than she realized. "Thank you," Emma said, the sincerity clear in her voice. "It's good to be here." News of the hospital's outreach programs reached more people, drawing larger crowds to each new event. Donations increased, allowing Naomi's hospital to offer more resources and services to those who needed them most. Emma found herself in the middle of this wave of change, contributing in small but meaningful ways that expanded her understanding of compassion and service. The growth in her life wasn't confined to the hospital. It seeped into her work with the airline, where she began advocating for more inclusive training programs, encouraging discussions about empathy and unconscious bias. She shared her story in small crew meetings, not to dwell on her mistakes, but to illustrate the power of change. Her relationship with Charlotte deepened too. They spent evenings talking about the health events, with Charlotte sharing her own stories of teaching and the lessons she learned about seeing her students for who they were. It was as if Emma's new chapter had opened a window in their relationship, letting in light that had long been absent. At the close of one particularly successful event, Naomi gathered the volunteers to thank them. Emma stood beside Sophie, the sounds of laughter and clapping filling the room. "Today was another example of what we can accomplish when we come together," Naomi said, her eyes meeting Emma's in a moment of shared understanding. "This isn't just about healthcare. It's about seeing each other, supporting each other, and making room for growth." Emma felt a wave of pride swell in her chest. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about continuing the journey, one step at a time, with open eyes and an open heart. She knew that every story she heard, every person she met, added to the fabric of who she was becoming. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in gold and shadow, Emma turned to Sophie. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" Sophie grinned, a playful spark in her eyes. "Yeah, Emma, it really is." And Emma believed her. The success of the hospital's community programs caught the attention of local media. Articles about Dr. Naomi Bennett's leadership and the team's efforts were shared widely, showcasing the positive impact on underserved neighborhoods. Emma found her name mentioned in a few pieces as well, often as a supporting figure in Naomi's initiatives. While most of the coverage was positive, not all attention was welcome. Online forums and social media, places where praise and criticism often collided, began to dissect the viral flight video again. Old discussions resurfaced, blending with new voices questioning how deeply change could go and whether true transformation was possible. Emma read through the comments one evening, the glow of her phone screen casting harsh shadows across her face. Most were supportive, but a few stung, reopening old doubts. "People don't change overnight," one comment read, drawing dozens of likes. "Is she doing this because she means it, or because she was caught?" Sophie called that night, her voice light but concerned. I saw some of the comments. Don't let them get to you. Emma sighed, leaning against her kitchen counter. I'm trying not to, but I can't help wondering if they're right. How do I prove that this is real, not just some reaction to being in the spotlight? Sophie's silence was thoughtful before she said, by continuing to show up. By doing what you've been doing. People will say what they want, but actions are what matter. Emma nodded, knowing Sophie was right. This journey wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about staying true to what she had committed to, even when doubts crept in. A week later, the hospital was busy preparing for a large health workshop on preventative care. Emma arrived early to help set up, placing pamphlets on tables and organizing chairs in neat rows. Naomi was overseeing the preparations, her focus unwavering despite the constant interruptions. The event drew a larger crowd than expected, and as Emma moved through the room, she felt the buzz of anticipation. People of all ages filled the seats, eager to learn and share their stories. The energy was infectious, but it was also fragile, requiring careful handling. Midway through the workshop, a middle-aged man stood to ask a question, his voice loud and confrontational. All of this is great, but what about those of us who've been ignored? What about the times we reached out and were met with silence? The room tensed, the question striking a chord with more people than Emma had anticipated. She felt eyes shift to her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. Naomi stepped in, her voice calm. Your frustration is valid, and it's why we're here today. This isn't about erasing the past, but building trust moving forward. Everyone here has experienced feeling unseen in one way or another. That's why we listen, we learn, and we keep pushing for change. Emma took a deep breath and added, and it's why we're here, not just as professionals, but as people who care. This isn't a one-time event. It's the start of a conversation that we all need to be part of. The man nodded slowly, sitting back down, and the tension in the room eased. The moment was a reminder that challenges would come, but it also reaffirmed why they were necessary. After the workshop ended and most attendees had left, Emma found Naomi organizing leftover materials in a quiet corner of the room. Emma approached, sensing an opportunity for a moment of reflection. Thank you for stepping in back there, Emma said, leaning against the table. Naomi glanced at her and nodded. It's part of the work. People need to know that their frustrations are heard. That's how we start healing. Emma ran a hand over her arm, the evening air cooling the sweat on her skin. Do you think it ever really gets easier? Naomi's smile was faint, but understanding. No. But it becomes more meaningful? The more you show up, the more trust you build. And trust is slow, Emma. It's earned one conversation, one action at a time. The room grew quieter as the last few volunteers filed out. Emma realized that Naomi's words mirrored what she had been learning in her own life. Not just in the community, but within herself. Change wasn't a destination. It was a series of decisions made day by day. That night, Emma returned home to find an envelope in her mailbox. It was addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize, but bore the hospital's return address. Opening it, she discovered a letter from a woman named Elaine Parker, an older patient who had attended the workshop. Dear Emma, I wanted to thank you for what you said today. I've been coming to these workshops for years, and today was the first time I felt like people were speaking from a place of personal truth. I don't know your whole story, but I can see you're trying, and that's more than a lot of people ever do. Keep going. We need more people like you. With gratitude, Elaine. Emma sat down on the steps of her porch, the letter trembling in her hands. It wasn't praise that soothed her doubts, but the simple acknowledgement that someone saw her efforts. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer she reserved for things that reminded her why she kept going. The next day, Emma shared the letter with Sophie during their coffee break. Sophie's eyes lit up as she read it, her smile wide. See? You're making a difference, even if you can't see it every day. Emma nodded, a warm sensation spreading through her. The doubts still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over her. Each day, each interaction was a step in the right direction, a testament to the decision she'd made to keep moving forward. At the next event, Emma noticed the same man from the workshop, standing on the edge of the crowd. He caught her eye and gave a small, hesitant nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, but one that spoke volumes. Emma returned the gesture, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Change was slow, but it was happening. The months that followed were filled with more workshops, outreach programs, and late-night planning meetings. Naomi's hospital gained enough funding to expand its programs, attracting new volunteers and building a stronger bridge between healthcare professionals and the community. Emma's involvement deepened, not just as a volunteer, but as an advocate within her own circles. Conversations at work shifted too. Emma shared stories about the community events during her breaks, sparking discussions among the flight crew that hadn't been possible before. The airline took notice, inviting her to participate in an inclusivity panel to discuss her journey and insights from the past year. It was a moment of validation, but more importantly, it was a chance to contribute to a wider change. One afternoon, as Emma walked into the hospital for another event, Naomi caught her eye from across the room and nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a reminder that bridges, once built, could carry both stories and people, connecting them in ways that were both fragile and strong. And Emma finally felt ready to walk across them. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the city when Emma received an urgent call from Naomi. There had been an unexpected outbreak of severe foodborne illness at a large community event, and the local hospitals were overwhelmed. Naomi's hospital had opened its doors to manage the influx, and she needed all hands on deck. Emma didn't hesitate. She changed out of her uniform, grabbed her volunteer badge, and drove to the hospital, her heart thudding with the weight of anticipation. The city was alive with sirens, their echoes bouncing off the buildings and reminding her of the urgency of the moment. When she arrived, the waiting room was crowded with worried families and patients in need of care. The usual hum of conversation had escalated to a tense, chaotic buzz. Emma spotted Sophie among the volunteers, handing out water and blankets. "Emma!" Sophie called, relief evident in her voice. "We're stretched thin, but Naomi's been incredible. She's managing it all, but it's non-stop." Emma nodded, rolling up her sleeves. "Tell me what I can do." Naomi stood in the center of the triage area, her voice clear as she directed nurses and briefed medical residents. Her eyes met Emma's briefly, a flicker of appreciation breaking through her otherwise focused expression. "Emma, can you assist with intake? We need someone to keep families informed," Naomi called out. "On it," Emma replied, moving toward the entrance where a line of worried faces waited. She greeted each family with as much calm and kindness as she could muster, taking down names, symptoms, and directing them to available stations. The hours passed in a blur of activity, punctuated only by the high-pitched beeps of monitors and the shuffling of hurried footsteps. Sophie moved alongside Emma, their interactions seamless as they worked to keep everything running smoothly. The weight of the night pressed down on them, but so did the quiet knowledge that they were part of something larger. An effort that was more than just duty, it was compassion in action. As midnight passed, the adrenaline began to wear thin. Emma's muscles ached, and her throat was dry from speaking to dozens of families. She paused for a moment near the break room, pressing a cold cloth to her face. The dim light flickered, casting shadows that felt almost alive. "Need a minute?" Naomi's voice came from behind, softer than before. She stepped into the room, holding a cup of water. Emma took it gratefully, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't expect it to be this intense," she admitted, taking a sip and feeling the cool liquid soothe her raw throat. "It never is," Naomi said, a tired smile playing at the edges of her mouth. "But we get through it. Together." Emma met her gaze and nodded, feeling the weight of those words. This moment, amidst the chaos, solidified what she'd come to learn over the past year. Real change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up, especially when it was hard. The sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn, casting soft hues of blue and pink over the hospital parking lot. The influx of patients had slowed, and a quiet sort of relief settled over the staff. Emma stood at the window, watching as the night made its slow surrender to day. Naomi joined her, folding her arms and letting out a long breath. We did it. The team held together. Emma's eyes were tired but bright. Thanks to you, your leadership is what made it work. Naomi chuckled lightly, a sound that carried more exhaustion than humor. And to think, a year ago, we were on a flight that changed everything. Emma nodded, the memory of that day now wrapped in so many new layers of meaning. I'm grateful for that flight. It opened my eyes to things I didn't even know I needed to see. Naomi's smile was soft, understanding. And look how far you've come. As the day unfolded, news outlets began reporting on the community's response to the crisis. The stories praised the hospital staff and volunteers for stepping up in a time of need. Photos and short videos circulated online, showing Naomi directing operations and Emma assisting families with a determined focus. The online chatter had shifted too. Instead of questioning Emma's motives, people shared stories of her involvement in the hospital and how she had become a consistent presence in outreach programs. Comments like, "Actions speak louder than words, and she's proven that change is possible," began to appear, bringing a warm sense of validation. Emma didn't need the praise, but she appreciated what it represented. A shift in how people perceived not just her, but the potential for others to change too. A week after the emergency, the hospital hosted a small thank you event for the volunteers and staff who had helped during the crisis. Emma stood in the crowded room, listening as Naomi took the stage to address everyone. The room buzzed with a collective sense of achievement and camaraderie. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we accomplished during the crisis, but the commitment that brought us together, Naomi said, her eyes sweeping the room and landing on Emma for a moment. It's the small acts, repeated over time, that create the strongest bonds. Emma felt a swell of pride and gratitude as the room erupted in applause. Sophie leaned over and whispered, "You know she means you, right?" Emma smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe, but this is about all of us." As the applause settled and people began mingling, Naomi approached Emma, a glass of sparkling water in hand. "I wanted to thank you for how you stepped up. You've become more than a volunteer. You've become part of this community." Emma accepted the compliment, the truth of it settling in her chest like a warm flame. "I'm just glad to be here." Naomi raised her glass, and Emma did the same. They clinked the glasses together, the sound a quiet echo of everything they'd endured and everything they'd learned. "To growth," Naomi said. "To growth," Emma agreed. As the evening wound down, Emma stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The city lights glittered in the distance, a reminder of both the hustle and the quiet moments that made up life. Sophie joined her, their silence companionable as they looked out at the horizon. "So, what's next for Emma Carter?" Sophie asked, the teasing note in her voice familiar and comforting. Emma thought for a moment, the breeze lifting a strand of her hair. "More of this? Showing up, listening, and maybe sharing what I've learned with others." Sophie nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a plan." Emma took a deep breath, the weight of the past year settling into something softer, something she could carry without fear. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but she also knew that she was ready to walk it. One step, one story, one act of empathy at a time. And as the city hummed around her, Emma felt a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Months had passed since the citywide health crisis, but its effects rippled far beyond that single night. Emma stood at the front of a conference room filled with airline employees and community leaders. The airline had invited her to speak as part of a new inclusivity and empathy training program, a direct result of her story and what it had inspired within the organization. The room was filled with faces she knew, including Sophie, and a few familiar colleagues, but also many she didn't. Some wore expressions of curiosity, others looked thoughtful, and a few seemed skeptical. Emma took a breath, remembering that change often started with those who were willing to listen and grow. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm here to talk about how a single moment, an unexpected crisis, changed the way I saw my job, my community, and myself." Emma recounted the flight that had altered her life, sharing not just the details of the emergency, but the realizations that followed. She spoke about the conversations with Naomi, the steps she took to become involved in the community, and the challenges that came with acknowledging her own biases. "It's not about grand gestures," Emma said, meeting the eyes of someone who looked particularly attentive. "It's about showing up and listening. It's about letting each small step lead you toward becoming a better version of yourself." The room was quiet as she concluded, and for a moment she felt the familiar tug of uncertainty. Then the sound of applause filled the space. Steady, sincere. Sophie gave her a thumbs up from the back, and Emma felt a rush of warmth. The conference ended, and Naomi was waiting for Emma outside, leaning casually against a column with a smile that spoke of shared understanding. "You did well," Naomi said as Emma approached. "Thanks," Emma replied, a hint of relief in her tone. "I wasn't sure how it would be received." "Trust me," Naomi said, eyes twinkling. "It was received? You're doing more than you realize." They walked together toward a cafe around the corner, the chatter of the city mingling with their conversation. It was in these quieter moments that Emma felt the most connected, not just to Naomi, but to the work they both had come to value. "Any new plans at the hospital?" Emma asked, sipping her coffee. Naomi nodded. "We're launching a mentorship program for medical students from underrepresented backgrounds. I'd love for you to be involved. Maybe share your perspective on building trust and understanding in high-stress environments." Emma's smile grew. "I'd be honored." A few weeks later, the mentorship program had its launch event at the hospital. Emma stood beside Naomi as they welcomed the first cohort of students, a mix of eager faces and hesitant smiles. The room was filled with the energy of possibility, a tangible sense that this was the beginning of something impactful. Naomi addressed the group, her voice imbued with the same confidence and warmth that had become so familiar to Emma. "This program isn't just about medicine, it's about community, resilience, and the belief that support makes all the difference." Emma added, "And learning is a two-way street. We're here to share, but also to learn from each of you." The students' expressions shifted, some softening with encouragement, others lighting up with excitement. The conversations that followed were lively, filled with stories of challenges, aspirations, and shared dreams. Later that evening, Emma returned home to a quiet apartment. The letters she'd received over the past months from people inspired by her journey sat neatly in a box on her desk, reminders of the small waves her choices had made. She called Charlotte, who answered on the third ring, her voice stronger than it had been a year ago. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling?" "I'm good, Emma. I saw the photo of you and Dr. Bennett at the event online." "I'm so proud of you," Charlotte said, emotion threading through her words. Emma felt her throat tighten with gratitude. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done this without your support." Their conversation moved to simpler topics: weather, a neighbor's antics, a recipe Charlotte had tried, but it was wrapped in a warmth that hadn't always been there. The experience had not only reshaped Emma's life, but had brought her and her mother closer, creating a bond forged through shared lessons and renewed understanding. The next day, Emma walked through the doors of the hospital, feeling a deep sense of belonging. Naomi waved her over to discuss plans for the upcoming community health fair, their conversation flowing seamlessly between logistics and laughter. As Emma stood there, surrounded by the noise of the bustling hospital, she realized that this was more than just a chapter in her life. It was the foundation for everything that would follow. The journey from doubt to empathy, from division to understanding, had led her here. And while there would always be more work to do, she knew she was ready for it. Thanks for joining me as we explored Emma's powerful journey of growth, empathy, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps bring more stories that inspire and connect us. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future updates. See you in the next chapter.